The Third Eye, for most of us, is remembered as the title of a fascinating little book telling the story of a Tibetan Lama, the story of a child, very high-born, recommended by the Dalai Lama of that time for special attention. Someone calling himself Lobsang Rampa, who grew up in a Tibetan lamasery under severe discipline directed towards the opening of his third eye. The opening of the third eye had been effected mainly through an operation conducted by two surgeon priests. The book describes the operation very graphically and also gives amazingly detailed accounts of life as it confronted the little boy in the monastery. The book was extremely popular, and people who had never heard of the occult were intrigued by it. Opinions were divided. Authoritative experts on Tibet were convinced of the book's genuineness, and astonishment was expressed that such secret information that it contained could be released for public consumption. Others, equally qualified, pooh-poohed the book, and the conflict raged on. Book sales were immense. The publishers had acted in good faith, issuing the book as non-fiction. When the uproar was at its height, with the pundits on Tibet divided in their opinion, an article appeared in the Daily Mail suggesting that the book was a con. A private detective had followed the author of the publishers to his home, which was in the Irish Republic. The author was an Englishman called Mr. Cyril Hoskins. He was the son of a plumber from Plymouth in Devon. He was fragile in health and had had great difficulty in finding work. Cyril Hoskins had never been to Tibet. He had never had an operation to his brain. He had written the book for money. He had shaven his head and changed his name to Dr. Kwan Suo. Nevertheless, Hoskins maintained that the book was true. His wife told her story. After they had changed their name, her husband began to talk a great deal about the East. He even occasionally wore Eastern dress. He became very preoccupied, and on several occasions she saw him fall into a trance-like state. He sometimes spoke in an unfamiliar language, which she later identified as Oriental. One day she looked out of the window and saw her husband lying unconscious at the foot of a tree. He recovered, but seemed stunned, and from then on began to act differently in a way she could not understand. His speech changed. His voice was deeper. He seemed to struggle with the English language. It was then that the book, The Third Eye, was written and became a bestseller. Now my own comments. The book is valid, I believe. It describes accurately the experiences of a Lama. Cyril Hoskins's physical body was used by the same Tibetan who was dictating to Alice Bailey the magnificent set of Bailey teachings. But the circumstances were different. Alice Bailey was always conscious when acting as the Tibetan's amanuensis. Overshadowing and using the physical body of the Englishman was a different matter altogether. The encounter was brief. During a sick spell, Hoskins vacated his physical vehicle and the Tibetan took up his pen. The very first book was a valid account of events that took place in the Tibetan's early life. I cannot speak for the books that followed. Cyril Hoskins recovered from his illness. He had earned the karmic reward for the surrendering of his physical body to the Tibetan. He went on to stay in Canada until his death. He wrote all the time. many, many books, but all of them must surely be regarded as fiction. We shall deal with a surgery described in his book that was calculated to open the third eye of the young Lobsang Rampa. Then there is, of course, the matter of clairvoyance that attracts us to the topic of the third eye. Much of the evidence for the third eye comes to us through those who have been able to use it in some way to produce clairvoyant perception. Some have had the faculty for using the third eye endowed them at birth. A single extension of consciousness may have produced it suddenly. Others have had to discipline themselves mercilessly to obtain the functioning of their third eyes. Sometimes it occurs in a single, unrepeated happening and never happens again. Some have been assisted by outside factors, for instance, in the dentist chair, when he has used nitrous oxide. I myself had such an experience with nitrous oxide in a dentist chair in 1951. So did Ouspensky. Winston Churchill, coming out of an anesthetic after a street accident in 1932, had a strange experience of presences around him. He wrote, "The sanctum is occupied by alien powers. I see the absolute truth and explanation of things, but something is left out that upsets the whole. So, by a larger sweep of the mind, I have to see a greater truth and a more complete explanation. And this comprises the living element. Nevertheless, there's still something left out, so we have to take a wider sweep, and this process continues inexorably." Now, there have been many great clairvoyants, like Edgar Cayce, Eileen Garrett, Nanny Besant, to name but a few. I have chosen the example of C.W. Leadbeater. He said his clairvoyance was as a result of being out of incarnation for 2,000 years. He had brought with him into this life qualities from the heaven world that made his clairvoyance easy. As Wordsworth said of such beings, "Trailing clouds of glory do they come. Heaven lies around us in our infancy." On one occasion in 1913, Leadbeater observed clairvoyantly a scene in London 700 years hence from now. He saw the Master K.H. with some of his disciples 700 years in the future. He shifted his gaze from them to take in other parts of the same scene, and he saw St. Paul's Cathedral standing as it is today, serene and beautiful. During the last World War, London, as you know, was very heavily bombed. The center of the city was practically destroyed. Those who knew of the Leadbeater prophecy wondered whether the cathedral would survive. To everyone's amazement it did, being hardly damaged at all, even though all around there was complete and utter destruction. But it is in the field of occult chemistry that Leadbeater's contribution to clairvoyance is titanic. Leadbeater's perception of the nuclei of all the known elements brought forth the amazing work, a book called Occult Chemistry, in which illustrations were provided of the structure of ultimate particles which make up the core of the atom. At that time, and for the next 50 years, science considered the elements to be built out of combinations of neutrons, protons, and electrons. Gold had more protons, neutrons, and electrons than did oxygen or nitrogen. The whole pattern of the elements seemed to be, according to science's interpretation, a dreary series of mere combinations of these particles clustered about the nucleus of each atomic element. Today, with the discovery of the quark, we are aware that the nucleus of the atom is a far more elaborate thing than previously envisaged by science. We know that there are a variety of energies contained within it and extraordinary movements of quarks, all suggestive rather of the observations of Leadbeater than the structures of the elements that were taught in our chemistry classes at school. It should be remembered that Leadbeater worked with Annie Besant at the turn of the century, and they did their research work in occult chemistry together. Annie Besant herself had high moral codes and was an esteemed member of society, a socialist and feminist, who often spoke in the Albert Hall to great crowds. It is said that she, more than any other European, did more for the liberation of imperial India. She vouchsafed the observations of Leadbeater, and I have often forecast, despite the falterings of theosophists themselves, who should know better, that Leadbeater's work will be vindicated. It is interesting to note that Leadbeater said that he formulated a long, tapering, funnel-like structure or shape from his brow in etheric matter in order to look into the microcosm of the atoms. Edgar Cayce's work is too well known to dwell upon here. He was not only able to examine the structure of the person's karma in previous lives, but could also diagnose illnesses of persons whom he had not even met, but who were in correspondence with him. I could also refer to the functioning of the organ of inner vision in that great mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Among many other powers he manifested, he often remarked how celestial beings virtually queued up to use his physical eyes through which they could look into our world. The mythologies of the nations are full of references to the third eye. The Egyptians called it the Eye of Horus. In Roman and Greek mysteries, the third eye is referred to as the swelling on the rod of the caduceus, which was carried by Hermes, or Mercury. Mercury being, of course, the messenger of the gods. In the Roman Bacchanalia, the baby Bacchus plays with a pine cone and a mirror, the mirror representing the astral plane that we look into when we are clairvoyant, and the pine cone representing the pineal gland, which was said to resemble the shape of the pine cone. In the New Testament, it is the organ of inner vision, which Jesus refers to in his words, "If thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be filled with light." In English mysticism, it is the horn of the unicorn, the sharpened instrument or blade of a mythological white horse, which was said to have been able to slay the lion of personality. The unicorn is a symbol of the soul, and the lion with which it fights represents the personality. Also in English mysticism, and I believe in the Bible as well, the third eye is referred to as a shining bowl. It is the holy grail of the Arthurian legends, and the knights in shining armor are the outer symbol of purification. The knights in shining armor search for the holy grail, search for the eye of spiritual perception which makes all things visible to them. It is surprising how often the abstruse matter of the third eye intrudes into public attention. In 1976, Americans began to celebrate their bicentennial, and the attention of the public was soon drawn to the important and relevant matter of the nation's crest, which, on inspection, revealed itself to be a symbol of extraordinary occult significance. A pyramid with its capstone absent and a single eye above it in a blaze of glory, the whole being mounted on a desert, the desert of materialism. One thing is certain: the founding fathers of the United States numbered amongst them many members of the First Congress who were from esoteric orders, especially the Rosicrucians, and it seems certain that they were trying to convey an important message through their choice of the crest, a message that would be passed down from generation to generation, suggesting that both the nation and its citizens were incomplete and that total integration required a factor that was hardly to be found in the material world. It suggested a numinous energy located both in the capstone of the pyramidal shape and somehow in the capstone of man. Now, it is surprising that the United States, with its essentially Christian background and strong Puritan influences, resorted to a crest that on the surface seems to have little of the Christian symbology in it. The implication becomes more apparent when we study the significant shapes into which spiritual man, as a yogi, is capable of seating himself. The most famous of these asanas is that of Padmasana, the lotus posture, the favorite position for seating oneself for meditation. It has been suggested through the study of the surface anatomy of this position that man seated for meditation adopts a pyramidal shape so that lines of the pyramid can be drawn through his bony prominences. The head then comes to lie in the capstone of such a pyramid, and the sacred square inch, which is traditionally located between the eyebrows, becomes the site of the organ of inner vision, the so-called third eye, which expresses itself in its donatory or positive aspect through the brow chakra, ajna. Now today we know much more about pyramids than we did a generation ago. Despite the enormous studies of Egyptology, which began with the conquering of Egypt by Napoleon, and the numerous and remarkable books on the subject which have emerged, very little has been given out about the hidden significance of the pyramid's shape and its relevance to spiritual unfoldment. Apart from suggestions, of course, that the Great Pyramid itself was once used as a temple of initiation. However, when we begin to accept the idea that shapes themselves, especially those which are symmetrical, are accumulators of energy, then the hidden significance of such structures becomes evident. This is not an easy proposition for the Western mind to accept, namely that all symmetrical shapes tend to store energy within them, irrespective of whether they are pyramidal or cuboidal or spherical. And this is true no matter whether the shape itself is built of stone like the Great Pyramid, or of wood, or even of tissue paper. Shapes on their own attract and store energies within them, energies that are peculiar to their dimensions. The ancients believed the universe to be constructed out of certain basic shapes, and we still talk of these in terms of the Platonic solids. What is still not yet recognized is that if these shapes are placed about us, they can, through their qualities, affect the nature of the vibrations of our environment. More than this, if these shapes could be created visually in the mind, they could be used as accumulators of specialized energies which could be released into the various bodies and directed to the openings of the chakras and their related petals. Hence we see that in shapes both outside and inside man's body, God indeed geometrizes. Charles Dickens used to keep the blades of his razors sharp by placing them in a pyramid, which suggests that some sort of magnetic force maintained the orientation of the iron molecules of the sharpened edges of his blades. We know that the energies at different levels of the pyramid are themselves different. The energy in the lower third of the pyramidal shape preserves mammalian tissue indefinitely. It is quite distinctly of a lower vibration than the energy in the apex of the pyramid. I wonder whether you noticed how quickly Monsieur Mitterrand took his guests, the 7 most powerful people in the world, to the pyramid that has been built at the Louvre and assembled them in it. The French, of course, have had great connections with Egypt in the past. They held Egypt for a long period of time before the British occupation. I wonder whether you know that Napoleon Bonaparte spent some time inside the Great Pyramid. It is said that he put a very important question to his higher self in the pyramid, and that the answer that was given him upset him considerably, and he refused to allow mention of the matter again for the rest of his life. Many suppose that the question he put was whether he would be successful in his machinations in Egypt and, of course, in Europe itself. The truths concerning these matters were brought home to me very powerfully during the years of my withdrawal in the early 1950s. It was a time in which I had to make great decisions about my whole future, and I felt a powerful call within me to go into retreat. I chose to do this in a desolate area south of Cape Town, South Africa, a place called Philippi. It was semi-desert, a region of many square miles of sand dunes and grassy flays. Philippi lies where the 2 great oceans of the Atlantic and the Indian meet, the former icy and turbulent, and the latter warm and often calm. Behind me, I had left the typical materialistic existence of an accomplished young man, well-educated, socially accepted, and prosperous. With everything before me and great prospects for making money, it all went sour. Nothing out there seemed relevant when a series of inner spiritual experiences began to invade my smug complacency from my 28th year onwards. These experiences came suddenly after being introduced to the ancient wisdom by a friend at a house party. At first, these spiritual experiences were a diversion and a talking point. Then they became progressively my most powerful concern, and finally a magnificent obsession that demanded the alteration of my way of life. I began to seek the meditative way of life and needed desperately a period of withdrawal in order to hear clearly what my higher self was trying to tell me. This took me to the wilds of Philippi. It demanded that I make a serious attempt at establishing a dialogue with my higher self. I was essentially unsuited to Hatha Yoga, being large in frame and often stiff rather than supple, usually from overwork. There was no way that I could put myself into the Padmasana position, and so I made one of my many concessions to the reality of my situation and decided to meditate rather in a club-easy chair, which I had retained after disposing of my fashionable apartment in Kenilworth. I had always been an early riser and instinctively felt my meditation should begin wherever possible before dawn. Accordingly, I would seat myself on a high sand dune looking out towards the eastern horizon across the Indian Ocean. It wasn't too long before I took to the site with such dedication that I decided to hump my old club-easy chair up to the top of the dune and wedge it into a position where I could watch for the sun and do my meditations. Observing the great red-gold ball of the sun slide upwards out of the Indian Ocean each morning provided for me a glorious object for meditation. I soon learnt to put that object in the sacred square inch between my brows, seeing it behind my closed lids each morning, long before it arose outwardly above the ocean on the horizon. Very soon it was possible to put the red gold orb in that position whenever I wanted to. I found, somewhat to my astonishment, that by thus visualizing this structure in the neutral position between my eyebrows, that I was flooded with energy. It was an energy of a very special kind. It seemed to make me more able to concentrate my attention, and in later years I had no hesitation in recognizing that this was the energy of will and power, and that in some way it was connected to the red gold orb, and that the spheroid shape could thus be correlated to the first ray of will and power. Some years later, when I emerged from my retirement, having discovered my higher self, as well as having learnt the purpose which that being had for me in this life, I was able to use this meditative device for flooding my consciousness with energy during my medical studies. It was a most supportive mechanism which made studying not a simple task for anyone after the age of 30 comparatively easy. It was only later, much later, that I began to understand the technique of placing the great orb of the rising sun in the sacred square inch was the basis for almost all creativeness, as it is practiced objectively by artists, poets, sculptors, and writers, but also by those who work subjectively in the realms of creative meditation, absent healing, and the seeding of thoughts in the minds of others. A decade passed before it came home to me in my astrological studies that my ascendant sign being Libra, Libra on the ascendant, I had been meditating on an object that exactly fitted Libra, Libra rising, which rules, of course, a sun coming up from or sinking into the horizon. Appropriate objects and shapes for visualization are, of course, always located in the meditator's horoscope. This serves to emphasize that structures may be built of any material, even mental substance, in order to store energy. People would find it of immense value if they learnt to use classical shapes as objects for meditation, placing them in the sacred square inch during their meditations. Now, the pyramid is essentially related to the second ray of love wisdom, and through this ray to teaching and healing. As a prerequisite to any act of healing, visualization of an indigo pyramid in this area between the brows provides a force center which acts as a reservoir for energies which will be conveyed by the healer to the sick patient. Similarly, the cube, visualized in the same sacred area, and especially in the color of emerald green, brings a philosophic disposition to the meditator and affects profoundly the attitudes to such matters as adversity. The words of John Richardson in the play As You Like It pertain here. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like a toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a jewel in his head. The jewel, of course, referred to here is the jewel that we can place between the eyebrows, a jewel that can provide us with the energy and the joy to meet any sort of adversity. May I quote to you from my spiritual diary of that time. Energy follows thought. Visualize a pyramid, a sphere, a flower, or just a corolla of petals, and energy flows into it. The visualized pattern or object becomes a reservoir of energy, the extent, quality, and intensity of which is decided greatly by the shape, its symmetry, and its occult significance. That significance is, in turn, determined by the extent of the chosen object or symbol in the unconscious of the meditator. In his race and in the collective unconscious of mankind, there reside enormous reservoirs of energy, which are similar to those which we can visualize in our own minds. When we do that, a rapport is established between those shapes in our mind and the shapes that lie in the unconscious. Not only will energy then stream into the visualized object or concept which you have placed between your brows, but the same energies will connect with all other similarly constructed objects, pyramids everywhere, flowers everywhere. When the visualized object is a patient in need of help, the phenomenon of absent healing occurs. You are not only energizing an image of the patient between your brows, but reaching the distraught person at a distance. This mechanism not only transfers energy, but life itself, your life, to the patient. The union of the life of the one with the other occurs in what we call absent healing. Yoga is a science that brings such mystical and occult processes under control. Any person may become a true healer without necessarily leaving the sanctuary in which he meditates. The yogi, or anyone learning to function in these realms, is in the process of opening the third eye. When people meditate on a particular object, like a flower for instance, they speak of merging their awareness with it, as if they themselves were the conscious life of the flower, as well as that which was flooding their own bodies. We need now to make an assessment of the total nature of man. And to do this, we will have to resort once more to diagrams and illustration. Man's physical body is only the outer shell or skin of a much more resplendent creature beneath. Interpenetrating the physical body is a much subtler structure, shown here in blue and made up of subatomic particles, described in the teachings of Theosophists and Rosicrucians, of yogis, and in the so-called mystery schools. This is the etheric counterpart of man's physical body. It acts as a unit of its own. It is a physiological entity. Indeed, it is said to act as a matrix to the development of the physical body itself. The yogis not only teach a philosophy based on its existence, but demonstrate the part played by this etheric body in man's totality. They maintain that it is this vehicle that vitalizes our so-called physical organs. In understanding any esoteric matter, we should always bear in mind the true and whole nature of man, not just part of him. The proposition of ancient wisdom is quite clear. The whole of space, the great universe that we live in, is interpenetrated by subtle matter. There is no such thing as a vacuum. Empty spaces are still infiltrated by the subtle material of the ether, a word that was used by Sir Oliver Lodge, the great scientist, at the turn of the century. Infinitely small particles, merely blurs of energy, if you like, form a vast continuum that fills the universe. And it is concentrated in the region of the stars and the planets, as is so in the case of our own Earth. It is concentrated not only in the Earth, but in the living forms that inhabit the Earth, the form of plants and animals, and of course of man himself. The yogis have shown that when we breathe, we inhale with oxygen the energy known as prana. Prana is stored in vitality globules found in the sunlit atmosphere. Here is one beautifully drawn showing 7 ultimate physical particles. Each one of these is on its own ray. 7 rays, 7 anu. Together they absorb the energy of prana, and when we breathe in, we inhale the vitality globules of the sunlit atmosphere into our respiratory system. When you're in an aeroplane high above the clouds, just put your eyes slightly out of focus and look out of your window. Soon you will see myriads of dancing silver globules of energy. They link themselves to the oxygen molecule, which is shown here as a spiral. Here we see the vitality globules actually linked to an oxygen molecule. And of course, oxygen is taken in when we breathe into the respiratory system. In the etheric body, which we have already considered, the prana is stripped from the oxygen molecule in the lungs and travels via nadis into the etheric body and into the physical tissues. In this diagram, we have shown very prominently the etheric chakras. These are 4 centers within the etheric body. They are surrounded with fine wire-like processes called nadis. These nadis pick up the prana which has been brought into the etheric body from the atmosphere. And these fine wire-like structures, nadis, soak up the prana and draw it in to the chakras. The chakras rotate. In good health, they rotate rapidly. They are placed strategically in the etheric body. They are always aligned with an endocrine gland. This chakra here is the sacral chakra of this individual. This one is the solar plexus chakra. This one here is the heart center. This one is the throat center, and this is placed in the region of the brow, the ajna center, so called. These chakras are lotus-like wheels which store the prana and transfer it into the organs and especially into the nervous system. The yogis have demonstrated their powers of controlling the physical body via or by means of the etheric body. The whole of the etheric body is organized by or under the control of 3 snake-like tracks, shown here in red and green and blue. These pass upwards from a chakra at the base of the spine, and they circulate the prana throughout the etheric body. They are called Ida, Sushumna, and Pingala. Spiritual development is a long process spread over many lives, in which energies are progressively drawn into the chakras. Through our many lives, the chakras open in higher and higher regions. In uncivilized, savage man, chakras in the head region will not be functioning, not even perhaps as far as the heart. But in highly developed man, the higher the chakras are, the more spiritually developed that person is. There is a special way in which the energies are taken upwards. For instance, solar plexus energies are always directed to the heart chakra. Energies from the sacral center are always directed to the throat center. Energies from the heart center are always directed to the brow chakra, the ajna center, so called. They indicate this by opening their petals, and in meditation a single petal may become the object of focus under the tene that energy follows thought. No living thing is without an etheric body, and all things live within a continuum of etheric substance, which was referred to in the ancient teachings as the anima mundi of the earth. All living things are linked together by means of the anima mundi. The etheric body of the earth extends beyond its surface, and sometimes we see manifestations of it in the aurora borealis. And so man's etheric body is part of the continuum of the anima mundi of the earth. But the proposition does not end there. There are even subtler states of matter, subtler states that interpenetrate both the physical body and its etheric counterpart. We call this astral matter. Indeed, there is a huge globe of astral substance interpenetrating the earth. It reaches out into space almost as far as the moon. This huge astral globe is several billion years older than our planet. It still influences all life on the earth, and its nature is emotional. It provided man with his emotional nature, which has to be refined by the process of spiritual unfoldment. Man once existed as an astral sheath in this astral world, billions of years before he elaborated the physical bodies that we know today. It is hard for the Western mind to conceive of mental and emotional substance, but that is how it is. We are, in truth, made up of a range of substances from pure spiritual essence, through mental and emotional matter to the etheric and physical bodies. Let us put it another way. If I hold out a handful of mud, you will know that water is interpenetrating the sand in my hand, and in turn the water is interpenetrated by air, three states of matter interpenetrating each other. Now we have a body of consciousness in each of these states or planes. The emotional or astral body generates astral substance when we feel. It pours out astral energy from us, and it floods into the astral world. We can almost feel astral energy. We can sense a wall of hate when we enter one room, and an uplifting emotion when we listen to some music. This is the astral body in operation. We can apprehend astral presences. We can apprehend them as horror, as lust, as hatred, as fear, desire, and so on. The astral world is layered according to the qualities which it possesses. There would be a layer for scientists. There would be a layer for artists, a layer for Christian mystics, and so on. The highest astral planes contain lovely beings who exist on their own planes and generate into them their high qualities. This part of the astral world contains reflections of the heaven world of the Christians, the Devachan of the Buddhists, the Valhalla of the Norsemen, and the summer lands of the Red Indian. In the same way, man has a mental body, interpenetrating his astral, his physico-etheric. The mental body leans away from form and expresses itself in symbol and image and thought forms. The mental body of man. Equally so, there is a mental globe interpenetrating the astral globe of the earth and the etherico-physical. It has its own planes of expression. Together, these subtle bodies, the mental, the astral, the etheric, and the physical bodies of man, combine into what we call the human aura. The aura shows itself in layers to the eyes of a clairvoyant, and it is, of course, invisible to most of us. The aura is a large ovoid, which varies in size and quality according to the spiritual standing of the individual. Together, these energies of the aura give an infrastructure to the human personality and endeavor to maintain it in a psychodynamic equilibrium with its surroundings. The American Red Indian was said to be the most psychic race the world has ever known. The Red Indian chiefs were initiates into the kind of knowledge that I present here. The Red Indian chiefs depicted their knowledge of the aura in their feathered headdresses, which were also structured in layers. But what of man's soul? The soul of man is a unit of energy that is immortal and enduring, whereas the other vehicles that I have described are progressively discarded at death. The soul is often depicted as an upright triangle, symbolizing its three main energies. These are Atma, spiritual will, Buddhi, love wisdom, and Manas, abstract thought. It is the repository of those energies generated by spiritual activity over many lives. These three energies of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas. The soul is formless. and yet it has been likened by the Hindus to a giant lotus, by the Christians to a rose window in stained glass. The sacred nature of the lotus was recognized and used in the sacred temples of India, of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. It still is regarded as the most spiritual of flowers. A thread of bright energy connects the soul to its personality vehicles. There passes down this thread, or sutratma, a flow of spiritual energy which constantly imparts meaning to the personality, so busily engaged in its incarnation. In the science of meditation, the sutratma is converted to a channel, so that there is an intercourse between soul and personality. Thus, a dialogue is established between the lower self and the higher. The soul rewards its aspiring personalities with deluges of spiritual energy that pass down this channel, sometimes called the rainbow bridgehead or Antakarana. The aura is flooded by the soul's energy, which enters via the chakras, especially through the head and the heart chakras. In this lecture, I have not given supportive evidence for these propositions, which are so contrary to the scientific understanding of the order of things. I shall put forward that evidence later in my lecture on the powers latent in man. Thank you.
Dr. Baker has spent 40 years of his life studying the ancient wisdom. His tireless efforts to make this knowledge available to all has resulted in the production of nearly 100 books covering virtually every aspect of the esoteric. The Jewel in the Lotus, a valuable introduction into the postulates and teachings of the ancient wisdom. Meditation, a practical guide to the art of communication between kingdoms and the recharging of personality with spiritual energy. Esoteric Healing, 3 volumes covering many aspects of this important subject. It is based on Dr. Baker's own research and medical expertise. Anthropogeny, man is far older than scientific theory would have us believe. This book explores the cosmic origins of man, reaching back to before time itself. Esoteric Psychology, an in-depth study of the 7 rays, how they influence man, and how to analyze one's own rays and those of others. The Psychology of Discipleship, at last a guide for those increasing numbers of people consciously treading the path of spiritual unfoldment, a difficult and arduous task made easier by the knowledge that others have succeeded and left signposts on the way for those who follow. Esoteric Astrology, Dr. Baker has spent 40 years developing a growing understanding of this exacting science. Fast becoming accepted as the astrology of the New Age, these 12 volumes provide a unique basis for a thorough knowledge of esoteric astrology. They teach you to interpret horoscopes and gain an awareness of that most important of subjects, the soul's purpose. These are just a few of the publications available. In addition to this growing number of books, there are 200 live recordings of Dr. Baker's public lectures made during his extensive tours of North America and Europe during the 1970s and 80s. For information about any of these products and for other video lectures, write to the address on the cover of this video cassette.